I've encountered this kind of thinking about the importance of the economy. Many years ago, when I got involved, I was asked by the Lytton Indian Band if I would help them prevent logging in their sacred valley, the Stein Valley. The British Columbia government had given a logging permit to Fletcher Challenge, multinational corporation with headquarters in New Zealand, to log the Stein Valley, and the Lytton people did not want it. So I agreed to try to help them and went camping in the valley, wanted to see what they were fighting to protect. And as I was coming out of the valley, we met a party of people at the trailhead, and you knew they weren't going camping because the women were dressed in high heels and dresses, and the men were in suits. But you know, when you're on a trail and you're all grubby and you meet other people, you begin to talk. And very quickly, I realized, holy cow, one of these guys is CEO of Fletcher Challenge, the company that's going to log it. And very quickly he realized, holy cow, that one of these guys is that shit disturber, David Suzuki. So needless to say, what began as a conversation quickly escalated into a shouting match. And finally, in frustration, he said, listen, Suzuki, are tree huggers like you willing to pay to protect those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay for them, they don't have any value till someone cuts them down. And that's when I realized he was absolutely right. Because as long as we argue in that frame, he could tell me exactly how many cubic meters of pulp there was, how many board feet of lumber, how many jobs, how much profit. And I have to go around saying, well, we could probably gather berries and maybe some salal bushes to put in flower arrangements, and maybe we'll find a cure for cancer. But of course, the real reason we were fighting to prevent the logging is that those trees were taking carbon dioxide out of the air and putting oxygen back in it. Not a bad service for an animal like us. Those trees are pumping millions of gallons of water out of the soil and transpiring it in the air and modulating weather and climate. The tree roots are clinging to the soil so that when it rains, the soil doesn't run into the spawning beds of the salmon. The forest, as long as it's standing, is performing all of these services. But when we use the economy as the frame within which we must argue, then of course that role of the forest doesn't enter into it. And that's what, for me, doesn't make any sense. And I know, that's why I was so honored to be asked to take part in this evening, that ecological economists are trying to grapple with this issue, to begin to see how we can internalize these kinds of services that nature performs. The problem for me is if you ask any CEO or politician, how well did you do last year? Within a picosecond, they will talk about whether or not there was growth in the GDP or market share or profit. Growth has become the very reason why governments apparently exist, certainly the reason why corporations exist. But growth, to me as a biologist, is simply a description of a system. Growth by itself cannot be just an end that we're all aspiring to. Surely growth is a means to some other end. But when we put growth as the very definition of progress, then no one wants to diminish progress, and we don't ask the important questions like, what is an economy for? Are there no limits? How much is enough? Are we happier with all this stuff that comes out of this incredibly productive economy? And those are questions I think that we have to ask ourselves. I believe, you see, that the measure of a society's prosperity is not in the number of obscenely wealthy people that exist in society, but in the condition of our poorest, our weakest, our most vulnerable members of society. And in that, I must say that North America cannot look to itself with great pride. By that criterion, North America is not a very prosperous society. Ever since Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, I, like millions of people around the world, was swept up in what has become the modern environmental movement. And I've watched with enormous satisfaction, the success of the environmental movement in the early years. When Silent Spring came out, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. And of course, now we have departments or committees on the environment at every level of government. And since that book came out, we've had laws to protect air and water and endangered species, and millions of hectares of land have been protected in parks and reserves. And for me, some of the successes I celebrated were, in being a small part of, were our success in stopping dams at Site C on the Peace River, and in stopping a dam at Altamira in Brazil in 1989. We stopped supertankers coming from the Alaskan North Slopes down through British Columbia waters to Seattle for refining. Stopped drilling in Hecate Strait, Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. And we celebrated all of these as great victories of the environmental movement. And yet 30, 35 years later, we find ourselves fighting exactly the same battles over again. And we realize that those victories were Pyrrhic because we didn't use those battles as a way of changing the way we see ourselves on the planet. So I think that it doesn't make sense then for us to go to Paris and negotiate the way we've been doing for the past 20 other COP meetings through the lenses of 195 national boundaries and 195 national agendas, economic agendas. So I believe that what we have to do is start from a fundamental platform of agreement for everyone around the planet. And I'd like to begin that discussion so that we all agree by suggesting that we live in a world that is shaped and constrained by laws of nature, laws that we can't change, that we have to live within. In physics, we know that we can't build a rocket that will go faster than the speed of light, and we live within that constraint. We know the laws of gravity mean that we can't have an anti-gravity machine here on Earth. And the first and second laws of thermodynamics dictate that we cannot build a perpetual motion machine. We understand that. That's physics, and that imposes those restrictions, and we live within it. And chemistry, it's the same. The atomic properties of the elements, the diffusion constants and reaction rates determine the kinds of atoms that we can chemically react and the kinds of molecules we can synthesize, and we live with that. Those are dictated by the laws of chemistry. And in biology, it's the same. Every species, and we are a species, has a number of, or maximum number of that species that can be sustained indefinitely, that is defined by the carrying capacity of an ecosystem or a habitat for that species. Now, humans, because of our intelligence, can adapt to many different ecosystems, but the biosphere is ultimately our domain, our ecos, as the Greeks call it, and the biosphere dictates the numbers that we can attain on the planet. Now, of course, that number is determined not just by numbers, but by the consumption or the amount that each of the population consumes. But virtually everyone I talk to in the scientific field would say that humanity is long past the carrying capacity of the biosphere for us, the way we're living. So those, I believe, are what we have to begin with, that the dictates of science limit and constrain the way that we have to live, and we have to live within that. And biology dictates or tells us that we are biological creatures. We are animals. And I've been astounded at the number of people that are offended when you say we are animals. I gave a talk in Austin, Texas, way back in the early 2000s. And I said there were a number of children in the audience, and I said, now kids, if you remember one thing from my speech, remember we are animals. Man, did their parents get pissed off at me. Don't call my daughter an animal, we're a human being. To which I respond, look, if you're not an animal, are you a plant? We are animals, and our animal nature dictates some fundamental realities. What is the most fundamental thing, the greatest need every human being on the planet has? So if we're going to construct a platform of things that everyone agrees, then surely the fact that if we don't have air for 3 minutes, we're dead. And if we have to breathe polluted air, we're sick. Surely we would have to all agree that clean air has to be the highest priority of people around the planet. And then every one of us is at least 60% water by weight. The problem with the body is we leak water all the time out of our skin and our eyes and our nose and our crotch, and we lose water, which means you have to drink water constantly. If we don't have water for 3 to 4 days, we're dead. If we have to drink polluted water, we're sick. So surely clean water, like clean air, has to be a part of a foundation of agreement of all people around the world. And then, of course, with food, we can last a little longer, but 4 to 6 weeks without food and you're dead. Eat contaminated food and you're sick, and most of our food comes from the earth. So surely clean food and clean soil must be up there with air and water. And finally, every bit of the energy that we have in our bodies to move and grow and reproduce, every bit of our fuel that we burn to liberate the heat, all of that, of course, is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis, converted into chemical energy. We then get it by eating the plants or the animals that eat the plants. And when we need that energy to move or work, we burn those molecules and liberate the sun back out into our bodies. So photosynthesis should join clean earth and clean air and clean water. And I believe those should be the foundation of the way everyone lives, to protect what the First Nations and indigenous people around the world call the 4 sacred elements for Mother Earth: earth, air, fire, and water. And the miracle of life on earth is that the rest of creation, the vast expanse of diverse species of plants and animals around the world, are what cleanse, replenish, create the 4 sacred elements.